Giles Brown.
Let's talk.
You're listening to Giles Brown on Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain. Rebel sounds, music as resistance. Well, the global history is dictatorships, oppression, racism, state violence. Music has always shone a light on dark places, I am delighted to say, because when this book, press notes, landed on my desk, I thought, this is just brilliant for me. The book is called Rebel Sounds. It's written by Joe Mulhall, and Joe joins me live on the line now. Joe, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, mate.
So because people think music is all, auto-tune and what Beyonce's doing, or, Gaga or this, that and the other. But if you look at it, there is a long history of music being able to inspire and to rally and keep a light shining when all is dark.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I realised researching the book over years was, when I thought about resistance movements or like political music, I was thinking originally of like singer-songwriters singing political songs. But actually, when you travel around the world and you talk to people about the music that was involved in fighting oppression and dictatorships, it's so varied. And it's basically, in many cases, it doesn't have to be political overtly. It was anything. It was people listening to music that they weren't told they were allowed to listen to. Or it was people just listening or singing songs because it made them feel human when they were being treated like animals. And it was just so varied in what you could class as resistance movement. And it was just universal. Every country I went to in the book, and I got to go all around the world in different ways. Every place I went, people told similar stories, even if the music sounded really different.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because if you say political music, people think, it's all very worthy. You're thinking like Woody Guthrie. You're thinking, I'm of a generation that had, Sting doing Saving the Rainforest and Live Aid and the Nelson Mandela concerts. But at the same time, in the Soviet Union and in Poland, which was part of the, behind the Iron Curtain, listening to certain sorts of music could get you in very, very big trouble indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to avoid some of that worthy stuff. So Sting doesn't get a mention, and Bono doesn't get a mention. But the chapter on the Behind the Iron Curtain is fascinating, right? Because some of the stuff that they were listening to, the way that the creativity, they were literally smuggling Western records over, like the Beatles in the 60s, smuggling them, or they would cut them, and sometimes they'd even cut them onto X-rays. They would get X-rays out of the bins in hospitals because they couldn't get vinyls, and they would use a lathe, and they would cut Western records. They would burn them on there and sell them in back streets and alleyways and stuff. And you can kind of tell this influence, even though all of this Western music was banned in the Behind the Iron Curtain. You can hear all these bands like Giles and these Hungarian bands and Polish bands, which sound like really odd copies of the Beatles in the 60s. And even though they're talking about love and, happiness and all the sorts of things that 60s pop was chatting about, often wasn't overtly political. The very fact that these bands sounded like the Beatles was a radical act, and some of them faced prison sentences or were banned from touring and that sort of stuff.
So how did you come to it? I mean, are you a music journalist? Because the listeners won't know this, are you a music fan? How did you actually sort of come up with the spark, if you like, for this book?
So I work as director of research at an anti-fascist and anti-racist organisation in the UK called Hope Not Hate. And our job is like researching and monitoring and combating the far right. And, all my previous books and all of my day-to-day work is looking at the worst people in the world in many ways. And I wanted to look at some of the stuff that was more the hopeful side of that, really, like what's actually worked through history when it comes to fighting racism and fascism and those sorts of things. And I'd always been a huge music fan. I'm a kind of dreadfully failed musician myself that was in lots of terrible bands. And I'd always been fascinated by music. And I kind of had a realization one day that through the work I was doing at Hope Not Hate, music had always been involved in that. I used to go, part of my job at Hope Not Hate was going undercover in far right groups around the world for a while. And I would listen to records before I went in to psych myself up, or I'd listen to records after to calm myself down, or we would listen to records as collectively. We'd also have people like Billy Bragg would do us concerts to raise money for us, and started to realize that music was kind of in and around everywhere, really. And so I started buying records that were originally like resistance music or protest music, and just fell in love with it and just started hunting more and more out. And then it's one of those, the more you look, the more you find. And so then it's like, you don't need to listen to Fela Kuti in Nigeria. You need to listen to the soul music that was fighting the civil rights struggle in America. You need to look at anti-apartheid music. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And that obsession eventually turned into a book, really.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Billy Bragg, because I'm of the generation that will remember Red Wedge. and the miners' strike. That is my generation. So that whole thing with Communards and all those bands, and earlier than that, or I'd be in my sort of really early teens, sort of like what you call a tweenie now, whatever. But I remember the Clash. I remember Blair Peach. I remember the Rock Against Racism and the Finsbury Park concert with this incredible sound. And again, you had people like the Clash getting together with reggae groups and just a huge concert. And can we just say that Right Wing have the worst music in the world?
Yeah, I think that's
if you're listening to Oi bands, then you know.
You just have to look at the artists that support Trump in America. They're all dreadful, aren't they? But I mean, I completely loved all that Rock Against Racism stuff. It was a big part of the movement that I'm part of in the UK, the anti-fascist scene. And like, as I say, like Rock Against Racism, I was lucky enough to speak to Red Saunders, who set it up, and hear all these incredible stories. And as you say, the Clash and the way they fuse that with reggae, with Misty and Roots and those sorts of artists. And I interviewed Billy Bragg to ask him about that, because he talks about how that was one of his kind of almost radicalizing moments, was going to the massive Rock Against Racism gig in Victoria Park in the 70s and hearing Tom Robinson singing I'm Glad to Be Gay and hearing the Clash sing and all that sort of stuff. And that was a great example where the culture, became this vast cultural movement that was so important for turning young people against the far right. When you had the National Front rising in the 70s, one of the things that turned kids away from that was music. And so that Rock Against Racism scene, not only is the music brilliant, but I think it's one of those tangible ones where you can say this movement had a real impact as well.
Yeah, and also it's a situation where it's a movement that has basically it's been organic. I mean, in the 80s, I talk about Red Wedge, but everybody always says, "Oh well, Live Aid." But that was a concert that was a kind of like a one-off. Whereas and there were egos and the whole thing. Listen, I'm not dissing Live Aid; it was brilliant. But what we're talking about here are those movements that begin, if you like, organically from the streets. I mean, you're talking about, the music of the 60s, and I always say this, and the listeners will be banging their heads against the desk, but nothing exists in a vacuum, and you can't have a masterpiece like What's Going On, for example, by Marvin Gaye, without having the civil rights movement and addressing those problems and all those sort of songs that people now think are clean-cut young men singing beautiful melodies. Actually, you're thinking Marvin Gaye, you're thinking James Brown. I mean, James Brown and the civil rights movement, it's not just Sex Machine, it's everything else in the back catalogue. And the way that hits hard and empowers sort of, the African Americans in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a massive soul fan and always had been. And like, what's fascinating about civil rights music was the way it kind of essentially, it was like an inspiration for people. When Martin Luther King dies in April 6, or is killed in April 68, Rosa Parks talks about, Sam Cooke being a balm for the soul and stuff. It kept people going, but it also reflects the movement, right? So in the 30s, you've got Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, which is talking about lynching and it's talking about the pain of the experience. And then you've got, Sam Cooke saying things are going to change in the early 60s. Then you've got Aretha Franklin by the middle of the decade saying, I want respect. And then, as you say, by the end of the decade, you've got James Brown saying, I'm black and I'm proud. And this is kind of at each moment, that's reflecting the birth of the Black Power movement towards the end of the decade. The music reflects where the civil rights struggle was, and it's pretty indivisible. And like in the book, I talk about, I think was my favorite record that I came across the whole time, which is Why the King of Love is Dead by Nina Simone, right? And it's off the Nuff Said album, and it's live recorded, and it was written and recorded 2 days after Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 68. And she goes and plays it live, and it is just this outpouring of pain and anger and rage. And it was written straight afterwards. And again, it's this wonderful example of how this horrifying event has happened and the way it was turned into this beautiful, powerful resistance message. And that record, I think, is probably my favourite in the entire book. If
you get the chance to listen, if you haven't, there's a brilliant documentary that came out called, I think it's The Summer of Soul, the 1969 live music festival. It was at 5 weekends in Harlem, and Nina Simone comes on and sings Mr. Black Man or whatever, and she also does the first public performance of Young, Gifted and Black, and it is a moment, to put it mildly. We talk about, institutional racism in the police in the States is obviously something that's been going on, but they get beaten up, and they get tear gas, and in some cases even worse. But it is a functioning democracy, even in the late 60s, even in the Nixon era. But when you are faced with a totalitarian system like apartheid in South Africa or the generals in South America, how does music make a difference, do you think?
Well, so yeah, I mean, in the book, I talk about like the military dictatorship in Brazil that starts in 1964. I talk about the military dictatorship in Nigeria in the 70s, and of course the apartheid regime, which runs from the late 40s right through till Mandela in 1994. And each of those countries, music's used differently. Like in Brazil, I talk about bossa nova and this amazing scene called Tropicalia, which starts in about 1967. And in some ways, it's a great example of that's not overtly political music. Often it's really odd music. It mixes like Brazilian samba, Brazilian bossa nova with American and British psychedelia. It's unbelievably cool. But it was like the fact they were using international influences was undermining the regime, and a couple of like Gilberto Gil and Katona Velosa got arrested and exiled. Whereas in Nigeria, you got Fela Kuti, who was just like front and center attacking the regime. He's released the album Zombie, criticizing the police. And when they killed the police raided his compound, they killed his mother. He takes his mother's coffin and drives it to Dodan Barracks in Lagos. And in the book, I go there, and he drops the coffin on the steps of the barracks of the dictatorship, and then releases an album called Coffin for Head of State. I mean, it was a far more confrontational approach than, say, you saw in Brazil. And then in South Africa, it's a mixture. You've got choirs from the ANC, the political party, right back to the 50s. You've got people in exile like Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela making amazing music. But one of the things I didn't know until I went out to South Africa and went record shopping was there was also like white resistance movement against apartheid. There was even like Africana music out there, and there was people like Kalahari surfers and people making like really odd or like Talking Heads style records. I guess the thing is that everywhere I went, the more you looked, the more you found, and some of it was really important. Other bits were important for one person, but I guess if they just changed one person's mind, that's enough, and if you get enough of that happening, that's I think it undermines. So it has that dual effect. It keeps people alive and struggling, but it also, in some senses, you can tangibly that struggle. Music doesn't change the world. People change the world, but music's what allows them to think that they can change the world.
Yeah, when I saw Searching for Sugar Man, which is the documentary about the guy who is massive in South Africa and doesn't know until he's found, and there's an urban myth, and the white musicians were talking about this underground scene in South Africa, and of course we, during the 80s, we just thought, well, I've never met as Spitting Image famously sang, I've never met a nice South African. So it just shows that we don't know what's going on in these countries. There are underground movements, and there are people standing up for these rights. Are they? I mean, we know that, for example, in Russia, Pussy Riot have been arrested because they go off, front and centre, waving sort of back. Do musicians tend to? Do dictatorships take musicians seriously if they are putting this sort of thing up? I mean, have musicians been disappeared, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, hugely. Dictatorships fear anything that challenges the system, and what music does is it opens people's minds. I mean, for example, the Soviet Union was a great example. The way that kind of culture crept through the small cracks in the Berlin Wall, and it showed people what they were missing. It showed that there was a world beyond the greyness with which they were confined in, and there's time and time again, whether or not it was Fela Kuti being endlessly arrested, or whether or not it was, I heard horrifying stories in South Africa of, the apartheid regime putting explosives in headphones and stuff on tape players. Musicians have been killed and have spent long periods in prison. And also, I mean, in some of the places, of course, people weren't just, imprisoned for like making the music. You could be imprisoned for listening to it, for owning a record. If they, and that's what I mean. I love music, but I'm trying to think if there's many records I would go to prison to, to listen to. And yet you just keep hearing these stories of people that gathered round, say in Nazi Germany, even in back rooms to listen to jazz music that they knew if they got caught, they could be killed or sent to prison. It really does kind of show the power of music, I guess, in that sense.
That whole thing with the degenerate art that the Nazis were so against. And also it's the way that music can be a way of opposition. For example, I'm thinking, obviously, songs during the Troubles in Ireland, and also Republican songs. I've been to, I'm based in Spain, and there was a dictatorship where people try and sugarcoat it, but it was a dictatorship, and the autonomous regions could not express their identity, however, through flamenco. And if you go to a Barcelona match and they sing the anthem, it's more, they say that Barcelona is more than a club, and that anthem that they sing during the time of the dictatorship was the only time that they could actually express themselves. And that's when people say, oh, I don't like music because it's just, it's just, I don't know, Ariana Grande or whatever. But things like that unwittingly can be turned into, the most basic song you might think can suddenly become an anthem, can suddenly become something that connects with a people or a struggle.
Oh, massively so. And I mean, in some cases, the songs might be political they're singing, and the words themselves might mean something to them. But other times songs can take on a life of their own. And for example, if you're told you're not supposed to listen to certain music because it's made by a certain, for example, there's a chapter on Ireland, and there was, some trad music was tried to be stamped out by the British establishment or the British colonial government, or rebel songs, you could be arrested for listening to them. And when they left the General Post Office during the uprising in 1916, as it burns, they sang the soldier song as they left. These things that ostensibly become collective moments for struggle and for whole nations, and people listen to these songs. And I guess one of the big things I noticed was how many people talked about. It reminded them that they were human, that they did have an identity, they did have rights. I mean, you mentioned, like the autonomous regions in Spain. I mean, similarly, in some senses, I went to Ukraine to meet DJs making electronic music right now, and we'd go to bomb shelters, to raves in bomb shelters, and they were making music, but they were using, and there was no words in this music, right? But they would go out to the east of Ukraine and find old folklore instruments and stuff, and they would try and move that into their electronic music. And for them, just listening to that and having that was turning around and saying, look, we are a unique culture. We're not Russian. We are a unique. It was the only place I saw where people said cultures used to build walls was they wanted to, say that they were a unique nation, a unique people. And so absolutely, the way that people articulate their own identity and culture is often through sound.
It's interesting you mentioned Ukraine, because a very good friend of mine is a musician, and he was based in Odessa because he said the musicians were really, really good there. And of course, we know what then happens, and he's in Ukraine. And you see the music coming out, and I'm not talking Eurovision, people, but you see the music that's coming out of there, and a lot of Ukrainian artists are now, around the world, or the whole variety of it, and music is a form of protest. And you're not getting that from Russia because it's been stamped on for now the past decade, and that's the real indication of where a culture is going, and the difference between a functioning democracy, however loosely you want to call it, in Ukraine, to an authoritarian regime, which they definitely have in Russia. Yeah,
I mean, I was blown away by how vibrant the cultural scene was. I mean, in one sense, you'd turn a corner and you'd feel like it felt very normal, and then there'd be a bombed out building, or there'd be a blown up tank, or there'd be sandbags and shattered windows, but the amount of cultural output that's still happening across the range. I went to see massive orchestras, the Ukrainian Philharmonic, that were playing by candlelight in a bomb shelter, at the start of the war, because they just felt they had to keep playing. Or like punk bands, as I interviewed this punk band called Beton, which did a cover called Kyiv Calling, which is a cover of the Clash's London Calling, and he told me a story about how he was down on the front line as a doctor, and he would write songs in the trenches and, record them on his phone and send them to his band, and they were still creating music on the front lines, and people were then listening to that music as they drove into battle. Or people, again, I like going out for a night out and stuff, but these people are saying, no, we're going to go clubbing, but we're going to do it in a bomb shelter because we still have to live. And the act of resistance for them was dancing. The act of resistance then would say, we're not going to have our life stopped because the Russians have decided so. We're still going to go out and do what we want, etc., even though that comes with huge risks. And so I couldn't believe how much incredible music was happening and how the music's changing because of the war. Lots of people said we used to make music that was for dancing only, it was for having fun, but now it's reflecting our struggle. It's and that's what I'm saying about them bringing in like traditional Ukrainian instruments and things to assert their identity. It's so vibrant what's happening there at the moment,
When I interview musicians, and especially after the thing we don't talk about now, the pandemic, etc., because they were all trapped at home. So for somebody like me, it was great because I could interview them because they weren't doing anything else. And we talked about getting back and going live. And one of the major things, they all wanted to go live, and we discussed this thing. And one of the great things about live music is connection. between the artist and the music, the artist and the audience, because you may have written a song, but it's the soundtrack to somebody's life. And that's with, a rock band. That's with, I don't know, I interviewed the guy from Black Crowes or Jane's Addiction or whatever. And I've just thought this connection is entirely different and stronger, because not only does it have a personal level, but also it has a social level, because everybody who's listening to this music, whether it be listening to Marvin Gaye, whether it be against Rock Against Racism, whether it be dancing in a club in Ukraine to a song they've now written, not only do you have the personal connection with the music, but you have the social connection, because everybody gets what it's about.
Yeah, I mean, and that live thing I think is really important. And when I talk about like the music often sounding different, but there being real commonalities, like I'd go to a bar in Rio called Bip Bip, which was a big bossa nova bar during the dictatorship, and people would sit around a table, pull out their instruments, and play this remarkably beautiful, bossa nova music. But then you could be in a pub in Dublin, and the same thing. People would come out, sit around a table, play these beautiful songs. Or you could be, at a nightclub again, and the music all sounds very different. But they're all, in some senses, using music. They're almost like history lessons. As you sit there, they're telling stories about their culture, about their identity, about their loves, about their losses, about their country, about their happiness, their sadness. And the music often sounds different, but the act of people sitting down or standing on a stage and playing live, and the audience consuming that music live, that collective experience, in some senses, it almost elevates it to like spirituality, where people actually you're imbibing culture and history and music together. And I think when we talk about why is it that music doesn't change the world, but people change the world, often it's because you go to those gigs, you come out of the gig and you feel 10 foot tall. And especially if the music is radical or you feel like it's fighting oppression, I often say I go to Billy Bragg gigs, because when I come out of Hope Not Hate after a horrible, hard week of work, when all we're doing is looking at neo-Nazis and fascists, come and listen to a Billy Bragg gig, stand there with a couple of thousand people singing songs, and you come out and you think, I can go back to work on Monday and do that again.
What do you hope that people people will learn from Rebel Sounds?
I think the point really of the book was to look back at all these amazing examples of how music has been used in struggles, and saying, well, actually, what can we do with it now? Because, look, the world's in a bit of a state. I'm not saying it hasn't always been, but whether or not it's, global warming, whether or not it's the rise of far-right populism and all over the world, the authoritarianism rising, all of these global problems, I just kind of want to re-add music into the conversation and say, yes, we want people protesting. Yes, we want people voting. Yes, we want people, doing social work and all those sorts of things. But when you're angry next time, don't just put on a record when you're happy or you're in love. When you're angry, go and find a record that's going to keep that anger going. And if there isn't one, go and write one, or go and find some people that will write one. And so it's just about saying, look, music has been wildly effective in so many cases, and here's some examples. Maybe it can be wildly successful and useful again. And, so I'd love some musicians to read it. And, I don't know what Harry Styles' politics are, because he never says, right? But, these people have huge audiences. So let's go and change the world. You have the opportunity to do it. Let's go and do it,
The book is called Rebel Sounds, Music as Resistance. It's by Joe Mulhall, we're speaking to today. Joe, if people want to find you online, obviously Hope Not Hate for a start, but where can people find you on the socials?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. There's Rebel Sounds Book, if specifically for this one, or on all the other social medias, it's just Joe Mulhall _, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and there's a TikTok for Rebel Sounds as well. So as embarrassingly old as I am, I do have a TikTok.
You lost me on that one. And also, you can order the book via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called Rebel Sounds, Music as Resistance. It's by Joe Mulhall. Joe, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.